Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Seth, one of the co-hosts of Engage Podcast, just to drop in and just say hi. If you're new to the podcast, if this is your first episode, I just want to say welcome. We have a great episode for you today. And if you are a returning listener to the Engage Podcast, I just want to say hi. If you haven't already, no matter where you're hearing my voice right now, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Overcast, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you can get notified every Thursday when we come out with a new episode. You don't have to look for us. You don't have to you don't have to search us. Boom, it's going to be right there on your phone waiting for you. Super simple and super easy. And that's what we all like, is super simple and super easy. Also, listen, if you have enjoyed this podcast, if it's been a part of your weekly routine, go ahead and hit us up at office@faithpc.net and just let us know what you think. Let us know your favorite episode, your favorite guest, who's someone you want to have back on the show. Just any way we can connect with you makes me and Pastor Anthony's day. So office@faithpc.net. We would love to hear from you. We'd love to connect with you and find out really just who listens to our podcast. I always see the numbers on the screen, but I never know exactly who listens to it, and it'd be kind of cool to hear from you. So office@faithpc.net, just hit us up, let us know what you think. Today's episode, we're closing off our Pastor2Pastor series that we've been doing in the month of October. We started off with a great episode with Douglas Wilson, who is like one of my personal theological heroes. His new book, Ride, Sally, Ride, was fantastic. I just finished it this morning. Not as it's like a shameless book plug, but it's well worth your time. One of the best things that I've read in a long time. But we had a great episode with him. Then we talked to Pastor Kent Bell of Bethel Life Church and Ministries over in Greenville, and he was a great person to talk to. Really enjoyed him, and a lot of people did too. Then we talked to BJ Rudge of Bill Rudge Ministries, and it was another fantastic episode, and I could have talked to him for another hour or so. It was so fascinating to talk to. And then we talked to Pastor Vince Belanca last week of Eagles Nest Church in Greenville, and he shared his testimony, and it was amazing, and I got a lot of good feedback from that episode. But today we're closing off this series with Pastor Rick Stauffer of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Sharon, Pennsylvania. It was great to have him on. It was great to sit down with him. We had a great time, got to ask some good questions, got to hear some good answers, and it was just a pleasure to have him. So give it up for our friend Rick Stauffer.
To Engage Podcast. This is Anthony Clauditis, pastor at Faith Presbyterian Church here in Hermitage, Pennsylvania. And today we have the privilege of sitting with Reverend Rick Stauffer. Rick is the minister at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Sharon, Pennsylvania. This, of course, is airing in the month of October, so I'm sure you're enjoying your wonderful crisp air. And this is our Pastor2Pastor series where we sit down with ministers of Word and Sacrament and talk with them and learn all about them. So we're glad you're here, Rick.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
We're glad you're here. And Seth, of course, is here, looking chipper today. Seth,
I am.
Were you lifting weights?
No, I went for a nice long walk.
Okay.
I'm a guy, I was raised going for long walks. My dad calls them death marches.
Okay.
But so I recently I do bicycling, and I'm starting going back into the walking thing. So
yeah,
nice.
That's good for your mental health.
It is. It really is. And I like to think of it kind of like how, Adam walked with God through the garden. That's the time I take, there's no music. It's nothing. It's just me listening to nature or just what's going on around me. And it's very meditative. So
I like it. So, Rick, you've been at Covenant Presbyterian Church how long now?
Just over 2 years.
2 years.
So I'm new to the Valley.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, sort of what led you to get here to Covenant.
Yikes. I'll give you the bullet points. So I grew up as a church kid in a home where going to church was fun, anticipated, and one of the things that we loved to do. And so grew up in that time frame. In my teens, had a moment in which that became very real and very personal. What I would say is a time in which I think Jesus engaged me, to use a good term, in the reality of that walk. So a lot of building up to that moment, but it became very real. In the midst of that...
you were a teenager?
I was 13. So just coming out of 8th grade after kind of a tumultuous year as an 8th grader. God kind of just got my attention through a number of different things, a number of different friends in my life at that point that kind of revealed to me kind of a double standard in my life. And God just kind of really sat me down and said, yeah, you in or aren't you in? And for a 13-year-old, I'm like, what does it mean to be in? Mm-hmm. But that was really influential in my walk. So met my wife when we were in high school. We lived in North Pittsburgh, and met her. Went to college. Out of college, went to seminary. Then entered ministry. I went in being a youth pastor. Did that for a number of years. Then did some family ministry as an associate pastor. And then for the last 16 years, I've been the senior pastor of a church in Austintown, Ohio. And we thought we might finish there. But after 15 years began to pray about, hey, we got, there's one more chapter to write here. Is it here or is it someplace else? Assuming that it was going to be there. And then God took a year to say, no, it's somewhere else. And then it became apparent to come to Sharon.
So this was Presbyterian the whole way through?
Yeah, I'm part of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, which is a bit of an offshoot of the mainline church, and doing it, but EPC the whole entire time, yeah.
So for those who are listening, and they're probably going, I don't get... I get Christianity, but I don't get all these denominations. You've sat and talked with people that are Methodist or Lutheran, or non-denominational. Now we're sitting here with a Presbyterian guy. For those who are listening, and not extensive, but give us the flavor of what it means to be Presbyterian, or maybe some essential tenets. I mean, just simple stuff.
Yeah, I want to be sensitive to Christ. So if I met somebody on the street and they asked me what it means to be Presbyterian, I would say two things. I'd say it's our style of government, in the reality that there's lots of checks and balances that slow the process down, but make us careful in the decisions that we make. In that we have a ruling group of men at the local church, but they're responsible to a geographical regional group that's responsible to a national group, and being able to do that. So things move slowly in that, but we believe that's a biblical form of government. And then I think the other distinction is just the reality of our theology, which doesn't make it any better or worse. We'll all be in heaven and get the answer later, but the reality of what we believe by virtue of God's being in control, having absolute and control rule of our lives, that's even determined the reality of our salvation. And so it's not about me making that decision, it's about God making that decision to love me. And then revealing that to me, open my eyes to it, that I might respond to it. That may be somewhat different than some other theological beliefs along the way. The good news is we all get to that place of belief, so we don't need to quabble. It's fun to talk about, but we don't need to debate over the reality of that. What we need to do is continue to look to the Bible, look to Jesus, and journey together for the sake of the kingdom in doing that. But that would be the flavor that I grew up with. It's the flavor that I've studied. It's the flavor that I wholeheartedly love and teach, and so it's the flavor that I continue to be in doing that.
Very cool.
Yeah. I think that's going to help folks out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're like, what's it mean to be Presbyterian? What's it mean to be this? What's it mean to be that? And I think just having a little bit of background and context is helpful for people.
Yeah. My thing is always, I grew up Lutheran, and I had a lot of Presbyterian friends, but even people, even some of my closest friends are non-denominational, Baptist, Methodist. And I love just talking theology with them, because my thing is always I want to know like when it comes to things like baptism or evangelism, whatever, right? How did you get to that point? Like, walk me through, when you read the Bible, how do you see that? And it's always fascinating to me how people just see things differently, or they interpret certain things differently. And I don't think I've ever had necessarily a bad conversation with someone. It always just comes from like, wow, I'm going to walk away from this conversation like with my mind expanded upon, oh, okay, like I understand now why certain denominations have certain, different belief systems or whatever.
Sure.
So.
And I think it builds respect as well, and I think we have to have room for that. That's why I think it's always good to have the discussion rather than the debate.
Yeah.
And so I love to sit down with people that think differently than me to learn and grow and understand. Because my stereotypes are can be way too founded on things that aren't true that I need to understand. And at the end of the day, it's about loving Jesus and knowing that Jesus has loved me, and that's what we have to. That's what we need to end in the midst of that.
So the theological fancy word is going to be things like predestination, which we're not going to get into. But I have a story connected to that only because Seth attended a Bible study that I led years ago, and we would take controversial topics. There was nothing under the sun that we didn't touch. There was no stone left unturned. We talked about same-sex marriage. We talked about abortion. Every touchy subject. And the room would be divided on kind of where you would stand, and people would kind of debate theologically, and it was a good time. Do you know, in 3.5 years, the nastiest it ever got, and when I mean by far, where people, this is 100% true, were literally crying, okay, where I had to stop the Bible study because people were ready to throw blows, was over the topic of predestination.
Yeah.
Which
is a shame, right?
It's craziness. So what you mentioned seminary? What seminary was that?
Reformed Theological Seminary. When I went back in the Stone Ages, there was just one. It was in Jackson, Mississippi. Now there's campuses spread across the country.
Okay.
Doing that, but that's where I went.
Thinking about your seminary experience.
Yeah.
What's something that you wish you could have learned there? One or two things, concrete things you think, man, why didn't they teach us there, in seminary?
Well, I first of all, I'll give RTS props, not just to put a plug in for them, but when I was going, the reason I went there is because they were looking to make a seminary education for those who wanted to be pastors more relevant towards the reality of being a pastor. And so I think actually it's a great question, because I think for a long time it became so academic that we lost the day-to-day, how to lead people, how to shepherd people, how to care for people. And RTS was trying to make some of those changes when we were kind of guinea pigs in that process in doing it. So I think they did that somewhat well. I would say the one thing wouldn't be what I learned or didn't learn, but maybe the structure of going into it. So I'm a graduate of Geneva College. I left Geneva College, went right into seminary, but I was in an academic mindset, right? So it's learn everything for the test, take the test, and then you forget 80% of what you just did, and then you go to the next chapter or the next thing. And I was around guys that had went out and either did ministry or had a career and then came back to seminary. And they were learning like tons more than I was, like because they had a grid to put it through, like an experience to do it. All I was there is for an academic exercise. And so I guess I would encourage people today with regard to seminary is to make sure that it's not in everybody's timeline. You can take time off and do a job and then go to seminary, but make sure that while you're in seminary, preparing for seminary, or even in college, knowing that you're going to seminary, to be out there doing ministry, finding internships, those kinds of things, that you're with real people, that you're with people that don't know Jesus, so that as you go into seminary, there's now a grid to put that through, and it's not just purely an academic deal.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes seminary becomes that. It's still the test, it's still the memorization, it's still that thing, and I just don't think you're internalizing a lot. I did watch that though in guys that I was there with, that they were, and I was like curious, like, man, how is that sticking so much in the reality of what you're doing? So that would probably be my response to that.
Yeah, that's a good answer. It's true. I found that to be true. I luckily I didn't do this intentionally. It worked out that way. That when I went back for a seminary, I was already A, working, and B, had experience. And my seminary experience was way different and way more rich than my undergrad. And then I, at the same time, was able to look at the other students, and I actually felt bad for them.
Yeah.
Because I thought, man, you're just gonna get tore up a little bit when you get out there.
Yep.
So it kind of caused this frustration with me. And again, there's no perfect education, but it was like, man, you know that we need to learn some of these things out there, and you're not teaching us. It's like you should do those things. But that aside. So then, what advice would you give a young person going into ministry? If someone were in your congregation were to come up to you in this current state of the world and say, "Hey, Pastor, let's sit down, let's have coffee. I feel a call to ministry." Right? I'm going to go to seminary. Here's my seminary. What advice would you give them?
Probably in lines with some of the things I said is just, what have you, I would ask the question, what have you done practically to understand, first of all, confirmation to that calling? So it may be a good idea. Are you doing it because, 3 generations of your family have done it, so you're doing it? Or are you doing it because you really sense God's gifted you, called you to that place? Because I don't think without the calling that you're going to find success in doing that. You got to be, I don't know that we can be absolutely certain, but there are things in life that people will do it. So I would invite them into a process of say, hey, well, how many months you got before you're gone? Man, I want you to go teach this Bible study, and I'm going to go do it with you because I want to hear how you do it, how you approach the Word in doing it. I want to be able to confirm that call. Now, as pastors, oftentimes we have that opportunity with students that are coming up underneath us, but I would want to put them in positions where that call is just confirmed in doing it. So again, just that extra grid of not going for the academic reality, but knowing where it is that God has a call on your life to be able to do that. So I would want to put them in as many situations as I can. I would ask them, how many conversations have you had in the last 2 weeks with somebody that doesn't know Jesus? Because you need to know what it is to be an evangelist. You need to know what it is to be able to share your faith with the people around you, and to be out there. And that's going to cement the reality of what you believe as well, and allow you to go to the place to learn and grow, but to do that as a whole person, not just as a brain that's trying to take in information.
So I imagine some people out there, the big joke, the running joke with pastors, and you already know what I'm going to say, you're laughing, is that, we work 1 day a week, right?
One book.
What is it?
One book, 1 day a week.
One book? Yeah, right. So, what do you think that the average person listening would be most surprised about learning about a pastor's job? Because, we all have these thoughts with whatever job it is. But I have just found that a pastor's job, so many people have so many different thoughts that aren't necessarily accurate about what a pastor does. And some people don't know at all what a pastor does. They're just like, hey, you're the guy that preaches once a week, right? Or goes to a hospital to visit. But what are some of the things that are not necessarily on people's radar?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe a church kid is the last person you want to ask, because you have this. I've had this all my life, right? Yeah. And being able to do it. But I would probably say this. I think the stereotype, and probably accurately so for way too many folks, is that a pastor just kind of takes whoever is in their church and cares for them. Right? So we're going to the hospital, there's crisis, there's Bible studies, there's preaching, and it's all about the crew that have gathered within their walls. And I think that's a misnomer, or should be a misnomer in the life of the church. I would see my role more not to care just for that group, but to mobilize them to care for others.
Right.
And even more so those that are outside of our walls. So my role is much more as a leader and an inspirer and a mobilizer, that I'm teaching you so that indeed you can go teach others, rather than just simply give you an education, keep it within our walls. And I think that's something that it maybe has changed in the church culture over time as well, in the sense that I think people thought the neighborhood church was a church where you went out and gathered people to come in. And I think it's changing that now we're taking the people that are in to mobilize them to go out. In doing that, which probably is a lot closer to the Acts church, the first century church, the church that started the church, than the prior model. But I think we're getting more and more back to that. So I think that would be the surprise. I spend some time caring for my people, right? I do that, but I do that always with the intent of, as I care for you, I want to mobilize you and equip you in order to care for others.
Because it can't be all about them.
No.
But here's what's so weird is that even that statement, it can't be all about them. I think for some listeners, that may not sit well with folks. Yeah. Have you ever caught flack from being, I would say, evangelistic in nature, or sort of not just, it's not just caring for the flock, and we're saying it poorly. I'm saying it poorly. It's both and. It's not either or.
Sure it is.
And I think you get into trouble when you just draw a circle around this is the church or this is just the community. It's both and. And so you're called to care. Who is my neighbor? Right. And so, but I think that people, when you lose that vision and that mission, then it's easy for you just to focus on yourself, and not you as the pastor. I'm saying the congregation. So how do you intentionally address that with the congregation?
Well, I think it's got to come first of all to what's your mission as a church, right? So the reality of our mission statement, that our tagline is, we're called out to be sent in. So the reality is you're called to be here, but not just simply to be here, but to be sent, right? So you're actually called to be equipped to go back out and doing it. I think practically, even things like a hospital visitation, right? So you go in and they have a roommate. And so you're there to see them, and you go and you spend time with them, and you pray with them, and you care for them. But on your way out, you stop at their roommate and go, "Hey, I'm Rick. I'm a pastor. You might have heard us praying. Is there some way I can pray for you? What's your deal?" And all this kind of stuff. And what you're doing is so that person may have been irritated as heck all night because that guy wasn't sleeping all night. But now you're communicating to them, "Hey, wait a minute, my pastor actually stopped and ministered to that guy. It's probably what I should be doing as well." And I'm not just the consumer here to get my pastor's attention, but I just learned something from him with regard to caring for the person next to me rather than keeping the drape pulled and doing that. That's a whole different mentality, right? If I just walk out of that room, it's all about them, and they can continue to be irritated. But the reality is no, my pastor actually stopped, and I heard him praying for it, having a conversation with that person. So even in those things, right? On a Sunday morning, the reality of my attention is always turned to people that I don't know. And so when everybody wants to hype on my attention, I'm going to be nice and cordial, but I'm looking for the person that I don't know, and be able to do that. And that begins a training process of how we look at church, how we look at ministry, and how we look at our lives.
So is this something, are you gifted naturally in that? In other words, this is just flowing for who you are? Or was this, oh, you know what, there was a mentor in my life that I watched do that, and sort of you learned through observing,
Yeah, so I think it's both and. So it makes sense to me, and so that it's hit a chord and nerve for me. My brother is also in full-time ministry, and is 9 years my elder, and so all of my life growing up, he was kind of my idol, and then as an idol becomes my mentor, and he very much operates in that realm as well. He literally, his job is to help teach churches how to do this better, and so that's part of what's ingrained in me. I'm naturally a people person as well, a bit of an extrovert, so I love the new relationship and I love those kinds of things. In doing that, I tell my people this so it won't be a surprise when they listen to your podcast, that I actually like unchurched people better than I like church people, because their stories are engaging and fun and good. And I love just to kind of surprise them then with when they ask me about myself. And I'm a pastor. And they're like, ooh, wait, I just told you like all my sins. And the reality is, it's like, well, that's cool. That's all right. Thanks for doing that. And let's engage, right? Let's have that conversation. And to begin to break the stereotypes of who the pastor is and who the church person is in that regard as well. So, and I think part of that's the communication to my congregation as well, right? I've told them that I like unchurched people better than I like church people, and they laugh and they chuckle and they get it. But also, it's a message, right?
Sure.
You should probably like unchurched people more than you like church people as well. We need each other. I don't want to overstate that. We go through crises, especially in the days in which we're living, and we need each other. We need to lean on one another and love on one another. But it is to equip us, says Paul, to minister to the saints, equipping the saints to minister to the people outside the church, and being able to do that. We need to do that for each other as well.
Yeah. I had the privilege. God sent certain mentors at different times in my life, and one of the ones early on, his name was Rick Rubies. He was he was a CEO, I think, of Atlantic Luggage, the one with the little seahorse on it. And he eventually stepped down from that and took a little Alliance church up in Erie. I think he's retired now. But I remember, I think I was a senior in high school, and we went to visit someone in the hospital. And for me, I was not raised in the church, so this is all new. Everything is new. Even the fact that we drove to a hospital and was going to go visit someone holding a Bible was super weird. So we go in there, and we visit, and he prays, reads a little bit of Bible. We're leaving, and some way he ended up in another lady's room, and he stood there, and he prayed with her, talked with her. And on the way out, I said, does she go to our church? He said, no. And I was like, well, why were you in there? He said, because she needs the love of Jesus too. And I was like, that was a really cool experience where I saw that, what you're saying. That's why I asked that question. Yeah. And so I kind of took that and used that in my ministry too. There was a few times where I was at an old folks home, and I went to go visit a fella, and he had Alzheimer's. So it was really sad. He didn't even know I was there. Mm-hmm. So I remember just sitting there and being a little bit frustrated, like asking myself, why am I here if he doesn't know? But then some way, shape, or form, I don't know if God opened my brain up and spoke truth into it. I looked around. And I was like, maybe I'm not here just for him. Yeah, right. So I just started befriending people, right? Yeah. And so that became my goal when I went to go visit not only just him. It was like, well, there's other people here too. Yeah. So I don't know. I just think that's really important, and I'm encouraged to hear that. I think that's good that you have that intentionality at the church. So
I remember one time one of the things that my mom and dad have always done that growing up was just so cool to see is whenever we'd go out to eat anywhere, when the waitress would come and take our order, when the food came out, the waitress always asks, is there anything else I can get you? My dad or my mom would always say, no, we're good. We're gonna pray. Is there anything we can pray for you about? And again, it was always like that would always make their day, or it opened up for conversation. And then there was one time, because my dad's a pastor too, there was one time a couple of years ago that he did that, and I said, Dad, why didn't you invite her to come to church? Your church. He said, my job is to lead her to Jesus's feet. He'll take care of that part. If I can get her to Jesus's feet, Jesus will find a church for her to go to. And I was like, wow. That's such a good, because the thing is that we always, at least growing up in the church, because I'm a church kid myself, it's you can get so bogged down into that mentality of, I just want to get people into my church. It's just about, it's my church getting my attendance up, rather than the main goal, which is get people to come know Jesus. And so
yeah, that's really important. In fact, I think if that indeed becomes the goal, and it replaces the goal of just being Jesus to them, everything about your approach will change. And all of a sudden, now your hypocrisy is seen for what it is, rather than your genuineness for people to actually see Jesus.
Exactly.
in doing it. So yeah, I think you make a really valid point. It's great.
Sorry, Seth, go ahead.
I was just going to say it. So how would you personally define success in ministry then, as a pastor?
That's a great question. For me, in my experience, I think the things that have been most rewarding to me, that I think the Spirit of God would place upon me as saying, this is why I've called you, is seeing fruit in ministry, right? So not necessarily conversions even, because I think those can become notches in your belt as well, but just seeing love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, see people's lives transformed from places of bitterness and anger and hurt to places of hope and joy and peace. And so I think that sense of fruit in people's transformation of lives is success. It's not about getting them into my pews. They come, that's super. But it is more about leading them to the feet of Jesus and helping them to see that, because there's a place that God's going to use them in doing that. So I've done youth ministry in a number of places, and just have been pleased to see some of those kids develop as nurses, doctors, as well as missionaries, to see them develop as architects and engineers, whatever the calling God has given them, but that many of them are still active in the lives of churches. And so there's fruit in their lives by virtue of that. So I would say that is where success has to come. It is seeing people's lives change. I think we walk on a continuum and a journey, and where we engage someone, we simply need to look at what's the next step. And success becomes when God partners with us to see them move to the next step. That might not even be conversion, but it's at least now asking different questions. That's right.
I just find it so, again, I can't help but think of the listeners, because we're talking about success. This podcast is in America. And truly, that answer is so antithetical to the American dream, because everything is about the bottom line. And I think that this is probably going to be one of the biggest revelations for folks that are listening who have never I even think church folks, because this is just who we are. It's ingrained in us. So what's so hard for folks is, how can you say you're being successful if your church is not growing? And it's like you're using the wrong metrics.
That's right.
And that becomes so difficult, because every job has an SOP, a standard operating procedural whatever book, and that's your guide, right? So we have one too, and that's our Bible. And so it seems that the church is the one and only place. That's again why I think these are important for folks to get a vibe of what pastors do. We're running off different metrics. And unless your leaders, your elders, your deacons, whatever, can understand that, you may be thinking you're doing a great job, right? So I was out for a prayer walk today. Okay, and yeah, you did that for 3 hours, and sure, and and I talked to Susie and I prayed with her. Now, for you, in your mind, I had a successful day. God had this wonderful conversation. It was a wonderful moment. She cried, we prayed, whatever, right? But if someone doesn't have that metric, you failed.
Yeah, that's right.
Because why isn't she sitting in the pew? So it's just something I want to challenge the listener out there, just to see that your pastor's calling and the scriptures give a totally different metric. What's up is down and what's down is up with Jesus. So I think the main thing is, when it comes to this question, you got to be faithful. Yeah. Right? Just be faithful. Yeah. So you're very evangelistic. What other qualities do you think are critical for a pastor to have? Let's do this. I want to divide this in two questions. Okay. Let's pretend it was 1950, and I ask you this question: what are the critical qualities a pastor needs? And then I want you to answer it in 2020. And you may surprise us, and it may be the same, but I just, for the sake of discussion, what do you got?
Sure. Part of that is being a historian, too, and thinking about the church in 1950. It was a very different age in which I do think that the neighborhood church sitting on the corner was the destination. And I don't think that was necessarily bad. That's where ministry was happening. You created programs within the church to get people to come to church and to do that. And it was still in 1950 okay, accepted, maybe even cool to come to church. In fact, maybe you had people coming to church that weren't even really Christians, but it was cool to be there because this stuff was going on, right?
So it's the thing. It's not only the thing to do, but it was a good thing to do. It was like, I want to do this.
Sure. So I think the pastor in that role then is the leader to make sure that your programming is excellent and that it's Christ-centered and that we're actually moving people towards Jesus, not just to a good time in doing it. So I think it was within the walls to take your people and organize them well so that what you were doing within the building was great and excellent. Okay. 2020... Nobody thinks it's cool to be in church. Nobody thinks it's cool to be a Christian. They're not going to come because the church is there. It's not build it, they will come anymore. So now it's flip-flop. Now you have to be the inspirer to equip the saints for the work of ministry outside of those walls. And begin to change those metrics, which most of my people were in that church in 1950, and they're still yearning for the church of 1950. Why aren't there tons of people and programs in my church? Well, it's because it doesn't work anymore. So the reality is what we have to begin to do is change people's minds to be able to believe, no, listen, you're the church, and you come in here, and we inspire one another, we lean on each other, we pray for one another, it's good, but the best part is the benediction when I give you a blessing to go out, because now you're equipped with something that happened here today that you're going to tell your unchurched friend about. And so now it's my job to equip and inspire people to be the church outside the walls of the church in doing it. So even for us at Covenant, we have this huge expanse that isn't filled anymore. And so it's like, man, what do we do with that? And part of our conversation is, well, how can we serve the community with the building that we have? Because I don't see it in the foreseeable future where we're going to be throwing a million programs in here because people aren't coming. But what we can do is invite the community to use our building in creative ways so that they're in our building and we have a chance to have a conversation with them about Jesus and being able to do it. So it is a flip-flop, and I think that's the difference of the 1950 church to the church in 2020, at least with regard to our role in doing that.
So I apologize if I've done a lot of talking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to piggyback off of what you just said. Yeah. I have one question. It's not going to happen right after this. And Seth, I know you have some things you want to talk about. The last sermon I preached was on. I'm pretty much finishing up James, and I preached through the necessity of praying for one another, and then going out, and if someone's lost, saving them. Right? There are those that are wondering. And I was talking to Seth earlier. I didn't say it in the sermon. It's one of those things that you think about after. James, the pastor, closes his book out with the verse. It abruptly ends. There's no like, see you later, or you're great. It's just go save people. And I was like, man, that's abrupt and it's weird. But I think, maybe he did that on purpose. It's like, it's the residual ministry of the church. It's like, hey, what are we supposed to do? Well, that. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing else to say. Now it's just go do it. Like, this isn't that complex. There are folks out there that are wondering and they're lost. Right. Go out and try to save them. Right? Co-labor with God and do this. Yeah.
And I think in that is the reality. Go love them first, because that's also countercultural today as well. So especially if they know you're a church person, they're going to expect judgment and hypocrisy and those kinds of things. So go show them that you love them no matter where they're at in life and what they're doing, with the hope of having an opportunity to be able to share Jesus with them. So absolutely. Absolutely.
Very cool. Very cool. So is there... I'm sure you love the entire Bible as a Christian, also as a pastor too.
He's especially loves Habakkuk.
But I was going to ask is, what is your favorite book or verse of the Bible?
Yeah, well, so as a pastor, I don't know if you have the experience, but you get to a text that you've researched and you thought about and you prayed about all week, and you get in the pulpit and you go, this is like the favorite place I have in the Bible. And it's like every week you say that, and then pretty soon, like, I don't know what it is. But if I had to pull back and say, for me, a place of depth, the place that I kind of go back to, it is actually, ironically, Hosea 11. So I won't give you full story. But the Hosea 11 at the beginning, God starts by using the prophet Hosea to tell Israel how much he loves them. I love you, love you, love you, love you. Then he goes, but you're like the harder I run after you, the further you run. Which reminds me of a dog that I had when our kids were young, right? That when it would escape our fence, the further you chased it, the further it would go. But if you just stayed there, it would eventually come back, right?
Yeah.
And that's what he's telling Israel. The more I pursue you, the further you run. You're going after Baals, you're doing all this kind of stuff, and all this stuff. And then God comes to a point in this conversation where he's like, but I can't destroy you. I should. I'm a holy God. You're a sinful people. You don't deserve anything. But I cannot pour out my wrath upon you. And it's this honest moment of God, of his absolute love for his people, even though they're idiots. And then at the end of Hosea 11, he reveals that this is how I'm going to call you back. I'm not going to pursue you to love you. What I'm going to do is roar like a lion. And when you hear the roar, you're going to return to me. Which is the story of Israel, right? They run away, they return, they run away, they return, they run away, they return. And it's my story in my life as well. But that chapter, again, the reminder, first of all, of how much God loves me. Then how idiotic I am, and yet he can't destroy me because he's made a covenant to love me. And then to begin to hear his roar. And so, man, this is the time of repentance. This is the time of return. And this is where I could go. So that's a place that I go often. That's cool. To hear it. So that probably is for me just that it's an honest place.
That's very cool.
And doing that.
I like that.
So
I like that a lot. So is there any person in the Bible who you identify with? Like when you read their story or you read what they wrote, you can kind of almost see yourself or your life experiences with what that person's talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's pondered through a number of folks. I don't know that I've ever been asked that question. So as I've thought about that, the reality of Barnabas, I think, is probably, and we don't know a lot about Barnabas other than he's a great encourager. And like Paul deserted him, and he was like, "Nah, it's okay. I'll go do my thing."
He's like, "I really didn't like you that much either." He just kept it to himself.
Right. And he just and steady as he goes, right, and be able to do it this day in, day out, and took John Mark back, right, and said, "Come on, dude. I know you ran away the first time, and maybe for our unchurched people, none of this makes sense, but you should read Acts, and you can begin to see that." Yeah. But Barnabas is just one of those steady guys that just continued to love people and. In doing that, and I guess if I wanted to personify myself by some, I'm not saying I am that, but if I wanted to personify myself with somebody in the Bible, I think God's gifting of me, His calling of me, probably resembles Barnabas.
That's nice.
And some of the most.
Nice.
That's very cool.
Yeah,
that's very cool. So, I think you already touched on this, but. If you could give one sermon to every church in North America, like you want to speak to every single church, what would you tell them? What would you say to all of those churches? What piece of advice, what Bible passage, what would you say to them?
Wow, that's a great question. I think so I'll say one thing and then I'll clarify a little bit.
Okay.
I'd probably go to 1 John 4 and say, listen, do you have any understanding of how much God loves you? Because in 1 John 4, he talks about the reality of the gospel that Christ died for us. He loved us so much that he died for us.
Yeah.
So first of all, try to absorb that, right? I understand how much God loves you. But 1 John 4 doesn't leave it there. He's like, well, so if God loved you that much, then probably you should love everybody else that much. And so that's not just church people. That's unchurched people. That's people that you don't even agree with regard to their lifestyle. That's actually your enemies that you're really called to do. So probably if there was one sermon with one text, it would be very careful because I think we can misunderstand that we're just kind of to love everybody unilaterally, doesn't matter what they think or do, and that's not what 1 John 4 is saying. He's saying to love as God loved us, and God loves us with standards, and God loves us with judgment and chastisement and rebuke. God loves us like a daddy loves us, right? And so it's not a unilaterally accept everybody, but it is loving them right where they're at, so that you can bear the fruit of seeing them take the next step towards Jesus,
right?
In being that. So probably one sermon with one text, probably lean on 1 John 4 and then go back to Hosea 11. And
that's really cool. That's a cool
and underscore it as well.
Very cool.
One of the things we have to be is just being mindful of our time. I do have one last question for you.
Sure.
Okay, so you are walking out of seminary or Bible college, whatever, to your first call.
Sure.
And you're able to go back in time and you meet yourself at the doors as you're about to walk into church. What advice do you give you?
Don't take yourself so seriously. I mean, I think there's a point in which we walk, especially walking maybe into a new scenario where we think we're God's answer to that scenario, and I'm not the answer, but God is. I just happen to bring him with me. And so I think there's a humility deal, which is probably, honestly, the ongoing struggle for me. So to go back to tell myself 30 years ago when that scenario actually happened, was, man, dress yourself more with humility. As you go, you're not going to save anybody. You're not going to change one life. But you have the opportunity to be a conduit of God, to see that happen. And man, not everybody gets that chance. And that's a privilege and an honor of the calling which you have. And so treat it with respect and treat it with the genuine humility in doing it. So don't take yourself so seriously.
Absolutely awesome. Listen, this is a great place to end. I want to thank you, Pastor Rick, for coming in again. Reverend Rick Stauffer at Covenant Presbyterian Church. They are downtown in Sharon, Pennsylvania. Do you have a phone number if someone wants to reach you?
Sure, I'll give my cell number out. That's fine. Leave a message if you're an unfamiliar number. Then I probably won't answer, but leave a message, and I'd love to get back to you if anybody wants to talk.
You certainly are a bold and courageous man, because now I'm going to start calling you at all different times of the day. This is Anthony Clauditis here at Faith Presbyterian Church, signing off of our Pastor to Pastor. We hope you have a wonderful week, and we look forward to connecting with you the next.